Assassin's Creed Shadows is an extremely interesting game from a tech and optimization standpoint. One thing is, there's part of the game, which I'm in right now, the hideout area, which requires ray tracing. Although if you're on a non-RT capable card, like a GTX 10 series, AMD GPUs before the 6000 series, it will do a software fallback. In this scene, I'm testing an RTX 3060. We'll test a lot of hardware in this video. So this is using the ray tracing here for diffuse. And I think part of the idea here is that this area is very upgradable and customizable, so I guess any sort of baked system they felt wouldn't capture what was going on here. Also, the game has incredibly dynamic weather systems, which is extremely interesting, and the game is also very scalable from a performance and graphical options standpoints. However, I do find that it seems to be harder to reach really high frame rates than many other games. But it's also not hard to get to a playable situation, especially if you're playing on a controller, which personally I feel like is the better way to go for this style of third-person game. Anyway, right now we're seeing kind of my older mid-range system. It's an RTX 3060 Ryzen 5 5600X CPU, but like I said, we'll test out higher-end systems, AMD GPUs, NVIDIA GPUs, all sorts of stuff here. Now, I often get asked what's in my personal gaming PC, and honestly, I play on my Steam Deck more than anything else. While oftentimes it's for the convenience of playing on the couch, in bed, or on my lunch break, the Steam Deck can actually make a killer docked desktop or even living room experience if you pair it with the right dock. Recently, I've been using this amazing 14-in-1 dock with RGB lighting from Ivanki, and a huge thank you to them sponsoring this part of today's video. I can easily run my wireless mouse, keyboard, and controllers while also plugging into my display at a native 4K 120Hz. Yes, the Steam Deck can output 4K 120 with the right dock, which is great for desktop mode, and while only a very specific subset of games will run well natively at 4K on a handheld, I've been using Moonlight streaming from my powerful desktop PC to get an amazing experience on my living room display without needing to spend the extra money on another PC for the living room. The Ivanki dock has an adjustable stand for comfort and cooling, all the ports I could ask for, including HDMI 2.1, USB-C, SDTF card slots, and Ethernet, while delivering up to 100 watts output and 65 watts max charging, and my kids are in love with the customizable RGB lights. The dock is compatible with all the major handheld PCs, so even if you don't have a Steam Deck, check out the sponsored link in the video description. Now, as we get into the graphics menu system, there's some stuff I really like here, but also some stuff that may be a little different or a little bit confusing. Let's talk about it a bit. So first of all, under the display settings, we have some good options. You have your upscaler type. Right now I'm running at native TAA. The game really wants to run in a dynamic resolution scaling mode though. So how about we talk about that for a second? Because that's really how the game's gonna start out unless you manually change it. So this game has FSR and DLSS and XeSS and its own TAA upscaling choice. And really the game, I think, usually defaults to automatically choosing the best option available for your system. Now, I'll go with manually forcing DLSS, which is what I think it would automatically choose anyway, since I'm an RTX card here, and it has some custom options here. What it really wants to do is use dynamic resolution. So really, you give it a frame rate target, like 60 FPS, and then you give it a choice for basically the upper and lower bounds of the resolution scale. Here we're at a 1080p output, and if I choose the quality level upscaler, it'll actually allow it to go as low as basically 33% per axis scaling, which is like ultra performance mode upscaling, but it'll allow it to range as high as a full native resolution, in this case 1080p since that's my output. And that's pretty interesting. If I go down to balanced, it'll range still as low as 33%, so you're not changing the lower bound, but you're changing the upper bound to only go up to 66%, which is what would normally be called quality level upscaling. So this would basically be kind of letting you to range between ultra performance and quality level upscaling. And then the performance mode here goes down to 25%, which is, I think, below what even an ultra performance DLSS usually is, unless I'm misremembering those percentages, and up to 50%, which is generally the performance mode upscaling itself. So the game's really designed around this kind of scaling system. Now, if we look at the effects of this though, I've noticed this game does not seem to scale as much around resolution as a lot of other games do. Although if I do go to this performance mode upscaling, then at these settings, you can see that it is holding around 60 FPS. I haven't frame rate locked it to 60, so it's kind of bouncing around that. And what it's doing is it's dynamically adjusting the rendering resolution to try to keep the resolution as high as possible without going below the 60 FPS. And but it will stay within the bounds of whatever you set there. Anyway, so that's kind of how that works, and that's a big part of how the game seems to be designed. This is generally how consoles work, so they're kind of carrying that over into the PC experience. And generally, if you want a consistent frame rate experience, I don't think this is a bad way to go. Rather than setting a fixed rendering resolution setting. Anyway, you can just play at native resolution here. We're gonna stick to the quality level upscaling so it can try to hold a native 1080p, but it can scale a lot lower than that if need be. And now you can see that we are holding, once you give it a second to kick in, roughly to 60 FPS-ish during this rainstorm, but it does dip below. So this is pretty demanding dynamic weather system. And like I said, we're in the hideout area, which does have the diffuse ray tracing going. Now, if we pop out of the resolution settings and look at the scalability settings, this ray trace global illumination at the top is a big deal. Like I said, in the lowest setting you can set it to is diffuse hideout only, where only in the hideout area is the ray tracing implemented. But you could also go to diffuse everywhere. And here's another thing I really like, is that if you look above me right here, it shows you what it looks like when you change the setting. Diffuse hideout only means that if you're not in the hideout, you're not seeing the ray tracing settings. And notice that diffuse everywhere, it shows you the difference. And I will tell you, and this holds up in side-by-sides, that this game's ray traced global illumination makes a very big difference in how the world looks, especially the lighting, shadows, it is a, there's games where turning on ray tracing doesn't do a whole heck of a lot. This is a game where I think you should use ray tracing if your hardware can handle it. And also, it's not necessarily the heaviest ray tracing I've seen, meaning that it's, I think, generally worth it to have some ray tracing on. There's also the diffuse and specular everywhere, so I think you want to at least get the diffuse. The specular, I think you could maybe argue is less important, getting those little specular highlights and things like that. But anyway, so otherwise, the game is currently set to the medium preset, and I had it as diffuse hideout only. But then we'll try out some of those other settings as well. Now, beyond just turning those settings on, though, there's separate ray tracing controls for the BVH quality and the ray tracing quality. So you can have some fine tuning beyond this. Also, there's just the overall preset. Right now, I'm at the medium setting, but again, you do get nice preview screenshots of what all of these effects do, and I love when games do that. Anyway, let's go ahead and pop into. I'll leave the settings where they were. And we're gonna go ahead and run out of the hideout area. So as we run out of the hideout area, we'll notice that because I'm currently set to diffuse only, the ray tracing will turn off as we leave this area. Interestingly, on consoles, the hideout area is locked to 30 frames per second is my understanding, which is kind of interesting, but I guess that's for consoles because it will force the ray tracing in that area. Here's another little thing I don't like about this game. Notice as I enter a conversation here, and maybe turn down the volume on that so it's not distracting. Let's see. Anyway, as I enter a conversation here, do you notice the frame rate counter locks to 31 frames per second? So there's two irritating things about that. Number one, I would like an option in the game to remove a frame rate cap for cutscenes. Just give me the option. If you want to have it capped by default, fine, but I'd like to have the option to remove it, and I don't see one. I think I saw a mod out there that allows it, but I think that should just be built into the game. Also, if you are going to cap the frame rates, why did we cap to 31 FPS? Because then somebody who is on a non-variable refresh rate display, if you're at a locked 60 FPS display, for example, then it's not going to be quite in sync with your display's refresh rate, which can lead to screen tearing or motion judder. So that seems like a very weird choice. That seems like it has to be a glitch or something, but that is what they went with. Okay, we are now out of the hideout area, and we can see some water reflections here. So this might be an interesting place to look at some of the reflections that that are possible if we do go into the ray tracing mode. But here's how everything looks at just medium settings. Again, we are allowing some dynamic resolution scaling to try to hold to the 60 FPS. It's doing so. If you want to look at the effect of turning the scaling off, though, we could do that. So what if we did want to just hold to a native 1080p? I'm going to be honest, I think most people will prefer the experience with the dynamic scaler just smoothing out the frame rate. But for the purposes of performance measurement, how about we go ahead and turn off the dynamic scaling, switch back to just like a native TAA. You could stay on the DLAA pathway, but that is a little more demanding than TAA. So if we want to just look at just kind of a default native 1080p medium, notice that it was using that dynamic scaling, because if I go to native here, we are in the mid 40s. So this is where I'm going to say that this game is somewhat heavy, and it does kind of rely on that dynamic scaling. But again, even at medium graphic settings right now, I think anybody, and this is with the ray tracing turned off, I think people would be hard pressed to say that this isn't gorgeous. So when you're looking at medium settings or low settings and thinking, when you're deciding if a game is optimized, there's a difference between a game looks bad and runs bad versus a game looks great but is demanding to do so. I think this game is certainly on the looks great side of things, especially with all of its dynamic systems for weather. How you can just go over and destroy bamboo. It cuts, everything's very interactive, which is another thing I absolutely love in this game. The world is so reactive and destructible to what you do. So I think that this game justifies the performance cost. That being said, again, I think the ray tracing is often worth it, although the exact settings can be a bit, dependent on how good they end up looking, especially on the water reflections. So let's switch this over to diffuse and specular everywhere. So we're now turning on all the ray tracing stuff even outside of the hideout area, but they're going to default to the low settings. Let's go ahead and apply this and watch what happens. So by the way, one thing I really like is this game, a lot of the settings can be changed on the fly. Notice that the screen just kind of blacks out and then it rebuilds it. But also, the game does allow you to change settings that require a restart, and it warns you and actually forces the restart of the game if you want to for sure apply those settings, which is good, although it will take you back to a save checkpoint. Anyway, do you notice how, while we are getting more reflections now in the water, I think this actually looks worse than when we were just not having the ray traced reflections due to how grainy that is. So this is one of the downsides I've noticed, where by turning on the all the ray tracing everywhere, I think it massively helps with the global illumination. I think things, not that it looked bad again with it turned off, but I think this helps a lot more with the global illumination. But the lower settings for ray tracing in the reflections, I think can look quite bad. So that's one of the downsides here. Now, if we turn up the ray tracing quality specifically, I think it does then claw things back to look better than it did in the in the non-ray trace version. Let's first go up to ray tracing quality medium and have a look at how the water looks here. So notice that now it's definitely more stable. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but I find it a lot less distracting. But I also don't think the performance was a massive hit compared to the low settings there, at least on this RTX 3060, which isn't some like massive ray tracing powerhouse or anything. By the way, later on we will look at some AMD GPUs in the video as well to get some idea of performance there. If we go up to ray tracing high, right, ray tracing high did require a game restart, so I've probably edited that little jump in the footage here. But anyway, you can see here again, things are looking even better. I've left the BVH quality at the lower setting. But anyway, so I will say that the lowest of the low ray tracing settings doesn't look amazing on the water, and that's just something to keep in mind. Also, you notice our frame rates are down in the mid-30s now, so turning up all these ray tracing settings is taking a toll on that overall performance. So this is really a game that can look pretty stunning, But again, you are certainly paying a cost to get there. So just, something to keep in mind. Now, if we go back to the DLSS and we go with, like I said, like the quality level, let's see, dynamic resolution scaling, then we can go ahead and take a look at what that's able to do to kind of bump up performance a bit here. Notice that while it does not get us all the way to 60 FPS, it does bring us back up to 50-ish. And I would say that things are looking pretty good here, despite having to deal with the upscale. So anyway, it's going to be kind of a personal preference, I think, on how much you want to rely on the upscale to get the frame rates that you're looking for. And also, what frame rate are you looking for? I've been able to find that on this kind of system, RTX 3060 and Ryzen 5 5600X, that to dial in the graphics settings I want, I just don't quite hit that 60 FPS, even with the dynamic scaling, unless even abusing it, really, to be honest. So really around this 50 FPS mark, if you're on a variable refresh rate display, I find it perfectly acceptable. So for me, that's kind of been a happy place to kind of stop here. And then the other thing I'll mention is that you can get frame generation support even while using DLSS on an RTX 3060 by using AMD's frame generation. Now, 50 FPS baseline, especially because you'll take a performance hit beyond that, depending on the person, you may or may not find this to be a good experience using the frame generation, but I'm going to go ahead and kick it on just to kind of show you that. So frame generation with FSR frame generation, which does support NVIDIA RTX 3060, 30 class GPUs, and 20 series GPUs, really any GPU here. But the idea is you can turn on DLSS upscaling to do the upscale, but use FSR for the frame generation. And I think a lot of people will end up this kind of being the preferred way to go, using some upscaling to get you to around that 50 to 60-ish area, depending on how demanding the area is, and then kicking on FSR Frame Gen from there to kind of smooth out those frame rates. You can see here that we are now able to get into the 80 to 90 FPS range, and things are looking reasonably smooth on the high refresh rate display. Keep in mind, you're watching a 60 FPS YouTube video, so you can't really see in person what I'm seeing, and the capture being out of sync may introduce motion judder or even screen tearing, which you would not be seeing on a variable refresh rate display. I find that latency-wise on a controller, I'm not feeling too bad for this kind of input responsiveness. Again, with the kind of combat system we're going here, I didn't find the blocks and timings too hard to do with the frame gen enabled at this point. So honestly, this is about where I stopped on this RTX 3060 based system at these settings. So it's roughly the medium preset with DLSS Quality Dynamic resolution scaling targeting 60, and then using FSR Frame Gen either on or off depending on your preferences. I think this is a game where I preferred it on, especially because a lot of this game, when you're running around, doesn't have the HUD elements going, which is one of the places I find Frame Gen can be a little more problematic. So in this case, I thought things were looking and running pretty well, especially again, considering just how good this game looks. Like, this amount of foliage is a lot. Like, this is a pretty impressive feat, if you ask me, as far as what they have accomplished here with the overall systems. Now, I do want to try out some other hardware, though, before we end the video. I've switched in an AMD GPU. This is now the RX 6700 XT. I'm in the same mid-range from a few years ago, Ryzen 5 5600X based CPU system. So basically the same system as the RTX 3060 was in, but with the AMD hardware. Now the 6700 XT is performance-wise usually a class up from the 3060, but often not when ray tracing. And right now we're running at those same ray tracing settings that I left off with the 3060. And here we go, the performance is actually a bit better on the 6700 XT than what we were seeing on the 3060. And interestingly, these were actually price competitors in the market for quite a while of their actual lifespan. Oftentimes both were a little over $300 during their actual, when they were new. So again, this isn't an AMD versus NVIDIA video, but I do want to show that AMD hardware isn't necessarily completely outclassed in the ray tracing setup as this game is designed, because it's really designed around consoles, so I think that's pretty important. Now, that was the native TAA, whereas the 3060 we had left off using some amount of upscaling and whatnot. So here we could either use an FSR upscaler or XeSS, or we could leave the game to choose on the automatic setting. How about we start with the FSR and try out the quality level upscale, but use it in the dynamic resolution like we were doing on the NVIDIA hardware with the DLSS upscaler. And that's where on this generation of AMD without FSR 4, there's going to be a bit of a image quality downside to this. So especially as I turn things and in motion, I do think things are looking a lot less good on the water and things here than we were getting on the NVIDIA equivalent settings. So that's one thing. Yeah, I really don't think the water looks great here with the FSR upscale. I don't know. It's kind of up to you to make of it what you will. Things get a little pixelated in motion, but do keep in mind that if you're on the AMD hardware here and you do want to take advantage of some of the upscaling, you're not necessarily locked into the FSR pathway. So you could try XeSS, for example, which oftentimes is less performant, but can sometimes have better image quality. So why don't we take a look here? And I actually do notice now that the dynamic scaler is having a tougher time locking to 60 FPS, but we are close to it. But I do think the actual resolve of the image is better than what we were getting with the FSR option. So I think it's having to push to the lower bounds of the actual resolution, but due to maybe a better upscaling pathway, things are maybe still ending up better despite pushing harder into the lower bounds of the upscaling. The other option is the TAA upscaler that is built into the game, which I think is what the consoles actually use, and those are based on AMD hardware. So if we take a look at that, this is what it looks like. I think you'll notice, though, that I do actually feel like the XeSS upscaler may have had the image quality win here, although performance-wise, again, this is having an easier time holding to that 60 FPS lock. So you've got a few options on what to do there. Also, again, you could adjust or turn down graphic settings and things like that. I'm going to go ahead and try out what if we went with the XeSS upscaling option and then kicked on Frame Gen from there, because it seemed to be getting us near enough to 60 FPS that could be a reasonable way to go. So let's go back to the XeSS-based upscaling, run around a little bit before we kick on Frame Gen, and then maybe kick on the Frame Gen. So XeSS dynamic scaling to try to get the 60 FPS lock. Again, when I'm out of that water scene, things do seem a bit less demanding on it. Again, don't love the upscaling here at 1080p, but I think it's passable. And again, lots of foliage, lots going on here. The game looks quite good. Overall frame rates wise, I think we're performance wise higher than we were getting on the RTX 3060, although again, I think the DLSS upscaler did have the image quality advantage. And here we'll go ahead and now kick on the FSR frame generation and kind of see where that gets us. So with the FSR frame gen involved, we are now able to hit into the over 100 FPS range. So if you were on a high refresh rate display, this is one way to go. Now, another option for what to do here would be to, depending on your preferences on the image quality that you get, degradation you get from the upscaling versus what you get from frame generation and the latency concerns, another option here would be to actually play at a native TAA, but then using frame generation to kind of fill out the differences. It's a bit of a low base frame rate for the frame generation, but not impossibly so. So if the upscaling artifacts are more annoying to you than the frame generation ones, this might be a preferred way to go on AMD hardware without access to like FSR 4 upscaling on the older upscalers. Anyway, another thing we might try out on a 6700 XT class GPU would be what if we were targeting 1440p rather than 1080p. So let's make some changes here. First of all, let's kick that frame gen back off, and then let's also switch into a 1440p resolution. And apparently I crashed doing that, so give me a second to get the game going. All right, we're loaded back in at 1440p. That's the first crash I've seen, by the way, in my hours and hours of playing, probably something related to changing the graphics setting. By the way, just overall stability-wise, I'm going to mention this game has been very stable. No big stuttering issues like you see in a lot of Unreal Engine games and all that. This is a custom engine from Ubisoft. And just overall, the PC experienceness, the smoothness, everything like that has been quite good. Also mentioned even on Steam Deck, get a fairly consistent 30 FPS, although it's relying heavily on dynamic scaling. But I've actually played for several hours on the Steam Deck and having a perfectly good time. That being said, at 1440p, native with no upscale at these medium settings plus some of the higher ray tracing settings, the 6700 XT is certainly struggling here, and we're at a under 30 FPS experience with all these water reflections going on. So yeah, it's not going to be absolutely amazing at these settings, but again, we do have a few options we could go with. We could turn down graphics settings. Another option is relying a bit on the upscaler. What if we went with that XeSS upscaler again? Again, kick on quality dynamic scaling, trying to hit 60 FPS. I have a feeling it'll fall short, but let's go ahead and see what happens. Looks like it's able to get us to, looks like in the mid 40s or so. And again, I think the XeSS upscale looks acceptable. We could run around a bit in motion here and kind of see how it holds up. So yeah, it's getting us to mid 40s. It's not an amazing experience here, so you could turn down graphic settings, you could turn off the ray tracing settings and things. But like I said, I do think they actually add quite a bit to the game. I'll be honest, playing on a controller here in the mid 40s, when you get used to it, if you're on a variable refresh rate display that can go into maybe low frame rate compensation mode if you drop low enough into the 40s, then I think this could be a pretty usable experience just like this. And the game does look, like I said, I really like the overall just art design, the open world. So like I said, I think there's a lot to be said for what you're getting here. There's also the option, again, of either going more aggressive on the upscale, turning down settings, or smoothing out the image with the frame generation, keeping in mind that that does not increase the responsiveness of the game. It increases the frame rate for motion fluidity, so it might look better on your display, but like I said, does not increase the actual responsiveness. That being said, the underlying responsiveness here for this style of combat, where you're generally just kind of locking onto an enemy, I might need to dodge or parry or attack. I've been playing this a bunch on the Steam Deck at 30 FPS, and it's perfectly playable. I don't think there's anything here that's unplayable at settings like this. So, again, I think you can get a reasonable, even ray tracing experience, even on older AMD hardware like the 6700 XT here. I'm curious how the newer stuff like the 9070 XT does, though. Let's pop into a high-end system and go through a few GPUs there. I ended up doing the RTX 5090 next because that's what was already in my high-end system, so this is most time efficient for me. Anyway, so this is RTX 5090 9800X3D. In other words, this is basically the most powerful system money can buy for PC gaming right now. And this is what the game looks at a absolutely maxed out native 4K resolution. And you can see that the 5090 doesn't actually lock 60 FPS at a native 4K. And I think given the amount of foliage and ray tracing, and like I said, I think things are very dynamic here, so it doesn't make sense to bake in a lot of the lighting because this is a massive world and it's destructible and all sorts of things. Remember, being hard to run at maximum settings isn't the same thing as being unoptimized. I have enjoyed this game on my Steam Deck with a fairly solid 30 FPS, and it's completely playable. So I think this game just has a massive amount of scalability here, and it can challenge even the most powerful hardware on the market. That being said, running a native 4K resolution, especially with a lot of ray tracing involved, is kind of brute forcing something that you don't really need to brute force. So if we switched over to DLSS, maybe we go with quality mode dynamic scaling to target 60. Again, it's going to try to hug as close to 100% resolution as possible, but dip when needed to hit the 60 FPS minimums. I think we're going to see that it can lock to 60 FPS in this case, and it'll be absolutely fine. In fact, it's actually given it permission to use upscaling enough that it seems to be hitting into the 70s, actually. which is quite nice. So that's what we get if we give it permission to use a little bit of upscaling. And I think things still look absolutely great. Again, you would absolutely hope so on a 5090 and 9800X 3D based system. So yeah, but things do look amazing and run perfectly well. From here, of course, you do have NVIDIA frame generation support now that we're onto a 40 or 50 series card that would have NVIDIA frame generation. So I can go ahead and kick that on as well. I think we're at a decent enough base frame rate where that's a reasonable thing to do. Kicking on DLSS frame generation. And again, this is not going to increase the responsiveness, but being over 60 FPS is responsive enough, I would say, for this kind of, like I said, controller style game. And this really smooths things out on a high refresh rate 4K display. And I did play it like this quite a bit and had a very good experience. If you look at the frame time graph right now, kind of ignore that. Frame generation doesn't report correctly in its current mode to this overlay software. If I switched over to like NVIDIA's Frame View or some other software based on that, it has more accurate representation of the frame generation for the latest version of NVIDIA frame generation. Anyway, so yeah, you can absolutely max things out on a 5090, just a little bit of upscaling, and you've got a good base frame rate from which to kind of go from there. Let's go ahead and assassinate somebody, because this is an Assassin's Creed game. And then, well, how about we try out some other hardware? Apparently, I should actually be watching the screen rather than my camera while doing some fighting. We got to dodge the red attacks. Those are unblockable. The blues are like, I think, a chain. Anyway, I have been playing a bit. The game is pretty fun. Hopefully I didn't just get like too much violence in my video now and whatever. Anyway, let's try out some more modest but still new hardware. By modest, I mean still extremely powerful, but it's not a 5090. I think looking at the 9070 XT up against the 5070 Ti would be interesting, as those are some big new launches. And actually looking at how they stack up in the ray tracing in this game would be pretty cool. So I've kicked in the 9070 XT now from AMD, and here I want to put this head-to-head against the 5070 Ti. So the best way to do that is actually to use the built-in benchmark system, which I haven't showed you guys yet. So from the main memories menu that you kind of load into when you start the game, or you can back out into, in the top left corner here, it's easy to miss, especially with my frame rate counters there, you have the Animus system. And from here, if you click on System, you can adjust graphic settings, but also use the built-in benchmark. So here, we are at a native 1440p resolution with no frame generation and no upscaling. I'm using the native TAA pathway, and the game is absolutely maxed out. This is ray tracing everywhere. This is the very high ray tracing, BVH maxed, absolutely everything maxed out in this game. And I'm curious how we run in the built-in benchmark tool. By the way, as a bit of a side note, while we run this, I'll say that the built-in benchmark tool does seem to be pretty representative of typical gameplay. So I think this is a pretty reasonable way to kind of check things out. Looks like my head is in the way of a bunch of the stats here. So, oops, that wasn't me. Wait, here we go. I clicked on the wrong thing again. Guys, I'm usually so smooth at this. There we go. I'm out of the way. Anyway, so here it is looking like we are, not locking to 60 FPS completely maxed out. But again, remember, this is maxed ray tracing settings and maxed everything else with absolutely no upscaling. Looking like we are hanging out, averaging close to 50 so far in the built-in benchmark run. By the way, the built-in benchmark run, like I said, does do a good job of getting a variety of scenes. So you get some indoor scenes, character conversation. You can see here that the frame rate is closer to 60 FPS, but maybe not absolutely locking to it. I'll also see the nice hair strand system. Like the hair strand system in this game does look very impressive. We're seeing a lot of the dynamic weather going on here with the pouring down rain, and it's going to swish into sun. Again, this is one of the reasons why baked lighting system wouldn't quite work as well in this game. In this large of a game with this dynamic of systems, day, night, weather simulation, all sorts of stuff. By the way, the weather simulation in this game is a lot more advanced than a lot of games. Anyway, here it gets into some combat showing on screen. At least a little bit. But like I said, actually playing the game and then comparing it to the kind of results from this built-in benchmark system seems to be fairly representative. Now, here it's looking like we're averaging, looks like about 52. Let's see if it jumps up a little bit by the absolute end of things. Okay, and that gives a pretty good idea of how things are running on this system. Now, before I unplug the 9070 XT, let's actually hop into the game again a little bit and mention a few more thoughts. One thing I wish, by the way, on this built-in benchmark system is that if it didn't have to load all the way back through this, so just as somebody running a bunch of tests, I wouldn't need to be wasting time kind of loading in and loading out. There's some games that are a little bit quicker in getting back to the menu and adjusting things and whatnot. Anyway, here we are actually running around that same scene we were in, testing out the other GPUs. And you can see again that if I reset the frame rate counter here, again, it is fairly representative of what we're getting here. Looking this direction, we're kind of in the low 50-ish range. Looking in less demanding areas, it's maybe a little bit higher. Here we're kind of in the mid-50s. So again, the built-in benchmark does seem pretty representative of fairly typical gameplay scenarios. Here's this water area that had all of the more difficult ray-traced reflections to deal with and all of that. So how about we start here and then play around with a few settings. Again, you can see looking in this area, kind of around that 50-ish FPS range. So one thing I want to mention is it does not appear that this game supports FSR 4 out of the box. So usually in a game that supports FSR 4, you can open up the AMD overlay and you would see an FSR 4 option that you can toggle here if it's not just built directly into the game menu system. We're not seeing that here, so hopefully that gets added. And yes, I am on the AMD driver that is an optional driver release, not the WHQL, that did list specific support for Assassin's Creed Shadows. So I am on that driver. So I haven't tried using like Optiscaler to mod FSR 4 in or anything like that, but I think that is gonna have an impact on the settings that I choose here, because I think we got a couple ways to go. Obviously, we could turn down graphic settings, but the game does look beautiful maxed out. Also, our frame rate here is kind of in the mid-50s, so on a variable refresh rate display, it's not a disaster. And one option right now would be just kick on frame generation to kind of smooth things out on the high refresh rate display. No, it doesn't make the game more responsive, but if I am playing on the controller, as I've said earlier in the video, it's responsive enough. Like, I'm not having any issues with the combat. There's not a lot of HUD elements being weird with frame gen or anything like that. And I think this gives a pretty good experience just like this. Now, another option would be relying on the dynamic resolution scaling, and then, of course, we could combo the two. So if we go ahead and turn the frame generation off, which is certainly an option, we could then look at instead relying on some dynamic resolution scaling. If we go with XeSS again as the option, I could go with the quality dynamic scaling. And by the way, the frame rate target here, I figured out why the 5090 in my test earlier in the video went past 60 FPS when I kicked on dynamic scaling. It's because I had the frame rate target set to 90. So you can adjust the frame rate target for the dynamic scaling. Here I'm gonna actually choose 60. And using the quality level, it should be able to range up to a native if it can hit 60 FPS at native, but can go below that if needed. And here with the XeSS pathway, I think things still look quite good overall, and we are hitting that kind of 60 FPS target as we run around. Upscaling looks pretty good. It's not having to go super aggressive or anything to hit that target, and so this is certainly a way you could go. Again, another option would be to kick on frame generation on top of that and get an even better overall motion fluidity. Again, frame generation will not be increasing the responsiveness of the game. It will be increasing the motion fluidity on a high refresh rate display. If we give that a second to kick in, you can see that we're now hitting around 120 FPS of motion fluidity. But there's a little bit, image quality impact from both frame generation and the upscale, and then we also have the fact that the responsiveness will be more like 60 FPS. But again, on the controller, that seems perfectly fine. Let's go ahead and kick in the 5070 Ti for some comparisons. All right, we've got the 5070 Ti in here. Everything is still maxed out, including ray tracing, and it is at 1440p resolution, native TAA frame generation off. So now we can go ahead and run that built-in benchmark run to get a apples to apples comparison with our 9070 XT. just for interest's sake, since those are kind of the new competitors that recently launched. And let's go ahead and run this built-in benchmark run. Okay, so remember the 9070 XT averaged 52 FPS by the built-in benchmark counter when we finished this run. This is interesting because it seems like we're on track to be lower than that, although I think later in this benchmark things get a little bit easier to run than they do at the initial start. Guys, this is with ray tracing maxed out. Now, I know other Assassin's Creed games in the past have often performed better on AMD hardware than NVIDIA, but I was curious how that would play out with maxed out ray tracing. Guys, I think the 9070 XT is better here despite ray tracing being maxed out. That is very interesting to me. Because I remember in this scene we were pushing right under 60 FPS on the 9070 XT. All right, that is interesting. Now remember, when actually playing the game on the NVIDIA card, you do have access to the DLSS Upscaler, which I do think is going to be producing a better image quality than the XeSS or FSR pathways that we go down using the AMD card. Although, again, it's looking like raw performance-wise, even with the ray tracing cranked to maximum, that it does seem like the AMD card is the leader here. So we're averaging 46 right now. Let's see if anything pops up a little bit or down at the end here, but I think that's going to be where we land. So 46 average. Very interesting. So remember, the AMD card was at 52. So 52 divided by 46 is 1.13. So it's looking like in this title, with ray tracing maxed, the 9070 XT is 13% faster than the 5070 Ti. Certainly interesting, because generally AMD is still behind in ray tracing compared with the 5070 Ti. Like I said, Assassin's Creed games in particular have a history of AMD, somewhat AMD favored performance. So that seems to be continuing to be the case, despite ray tracing being a new addition to the series here. Now, running around some actual gameplay, it's looking like, again, that is pretty representative. We're kind of in the mid-40s here on the 5070 Ti. So if we did want to go to a higher frame rate, I think this is where we would lean on the DLSS upscaling for actual gameplay purposes. So again, what if we go ahead and target dynamic resolution scaling with the quality settings so it can hit native if it's able, but has permission to go pretty low. No frame gen yet. Let's go ahead and see what happens. So it does look like it is going to be able to hold 60 FPS in this case. Now, I think that means that its dynamic resolution is dipping lower than what the AMD hardware was having to do. But because it has access to the DLSS upscaling algorithm, I think that means that your overall image quality here is probably coming out a little bit better despite dipping to lower bounds on the actual upscaling algorithm. And again, we do have the NVIDIA frame generation available in order to boost the motion fluidity. Again, stressing that it does not increase the responsiveness of the game, but it does fill out the high refresh rate display if you are on one. So if we go ahead and kick that on with the dynamic scaling, again, ignore the frame time graph. It's not reporting accurately on the NVIDIA frame generation. Yeah, it looks like we are able to get to an over 100 FPS experience. So interesting stuff. My overall thoughts on the game are that I can play this comfortably on a Steam Deck, and yet it can still challenge an RTX 5090. There's a lot of scalability on offer here, and the game can look absolutely gorgeous. Keep in mind that a lot of this is fine detailed. It's probably getting crushed by YouTube compression. So just do keep that in mind. This game really can look quite great. There's a lot of interactivity with the physics and dynamic systems and weather and things like that. Again, a lot of destructible environments that actually line up with your sword cut. Pretty interesting stuff. So overall, I'm actually liking what I see on this game. But yeah, it is certainly challenging though. It is scalable, but lower end systems might struggle to hit real high refresh rates. So that is something to keep in mind. But overall, I think I like what I see here. It was pretty interesting to see the AMD hardware, let's assassinate this guy for the ending, doing better than the NVIDIA counterpart with the new generation despite the ray tracing workload. So interesting stuff. I hope all of you have an excellent day.